All right, hello, this is Alex Bryant, President of East West Associates. Thank you all for attending the webinar, the East West webinar, Mitigating the Impact of US China Tariffs, the Operational, Commercial, and Supply Chain Counteractive Measures. Very briefly, we wanted to introduce East West and then walk through the agenda briefly on East West. The main thing about East West is all of our team members here today and the rest of the team members in China and Thailand and the U.S. have all had one qualification, which is they've all lived on the ground in China and Asia, and they've run U.S. multinationals on the ground in China and Asia. So they've dealt with these issues before, particularly the supply chain disruptions, the operating costs. Here, the 10 core areas that we focus on, but we focus really in three silos: operations, commercial, sales and marketing, and then risk management, background checks, compliance, fraud, and investigation. So here are the three individuals that are going to be speaking today. I'm Alex Bryant, founder and president of East West Associates. You have Mark Plum and Warren Wisniewski. Mark, I'll turn it over to you to give a brief background of yourself.
Sure. Good morning, guys. So yeah, my name is Mark Plum, and I've had roughly 35 years of experience in Asia, pretty much since grad school. Having started out in Bangkok and Thailand in the early 90s as a vice president for train air conditioning, and at that time I was fortunate enough to be down there and was to open up the train's first rep office in Ho Chi Minh, Vietnam, when we lifted the embargo. So that was pretty exciting. And then moving up to China in approximately 96, 97, staying there through most of my career till 2014 in China as president of Briggs & Stratton Asia, having factories in Chongqing and Shanghai, design centers, design labs in Shanghai, test centers, factories in Subic Bay, Osaka, Japan, a joint venture with Daihatsu. So all in all, quite a bit of experience, P&L responsibilities all through Asia, and last, as I said, the president of the last 8 or 10 years with multiple factories, just shy of 1,000 people in my organization. So that's kind of my quick background over the last 35 years and so in Asia.
Thank you, Mark. And Warren, you brought background to yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Alex. And like my colleague Mark Plum, I spent essentially the vast majority of my career on the ground in Asia with experience that covered manufacturing operations in China as well as across Southeast Asia and South Asia during more than 20 years on the ground, as I mentioned previously. I also held, in addition to my manufacturing and operations responsibilities, I also held P&L responsibility for a Pan-Asia business that had revenues approaching $1 billion. And during the course of both phases of my career, both in manufacturing and operations and in business general management, had significant experience going through periods of dynamic growth, continuous improvement, adjustment through M&A activities and others, and as well as dramatic restructuring. So I've kind of seen the whole life cycle of businesses across Asia Pacific and with a lot of experience in China.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Warren. Warren and Mark, just want to make sure you all can see the screen properly.
No.
No, it can't.
Okay. All right. We will take care of that. Okay. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Great. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay.
You can also see.
I beg your pardon?
We can also see you, Alex.
Okay. The next slide we have is on the US China tariff perspective. Here, we're going to focus it on the comprehensive understanding of the US China tariffs. The webinar is going to obviously focus on the counteractive strategies, products manufactured, sold, and procured between the two countries. The way we are looking at the market here and tariffs is that really tariffs is one of the multitude of challenges companies have operating, investing on the ground in China. Tariffs are new and unprecedented, and they've been going on now since earlier this year. But for those of us who've been operating in China for quite a long time, operating in Asia, tariffs is one more challenge for companies operating over there. You look at the other areas that we've identified that people know that are affecting profit on the ground. You've got increasing labor and overhead costs. You've got local and international competition. Environmental regulations is increasing substantially. You've got China 2025, which is coming down, which is more nationalism, more protectionism. Obviously, fraud and corruption, which has increased over the last 3 years. The IP risk, and then a number of non-tariff barriers of licensing of companies operating on the ground there. So the way we're looking at tariffs, the way we're approaching it is whether the tariffs are 10% or 25%, it's still affecting the profit margin and the ability of companies to operate on the ground. So today's webinar is going to be broken down into 4 areas. You've got one, the operation, which where you impacts the U.S. China tariffs upon companies operating on the ground there, an overview of that. Then the presentation of the 5 counteractive strategies, which are developed to mitigate the impact of the U.S. China tariffs. Third, we're going to go to the counteractive strategy development, and then the implementation processes. Okay. All right. Okay. And now we're looking at the key impacts of China.
Alex, you're back up. Your image is
Good.
Yeah, good. It was making.
You can see the screen, I assume. And you and Mark can see the screens.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
So we're going to talk about the key impacts. We're going to move through these 4 steps pretty quickly because the main focus here is going to be on the counteractive strategies and implementing that on the ground in China. So we'll hit the key impacts pretty quickly. One, it's going to affect the 2018 supply chain trends. Obviously, that's a significant risk, and everyone has been operating and seeing that on the ground already. 80% of the manufacturers talk about negative impact to the company's profitability, increased raw materials and components, long-term threats to China tariffs. One of is going to be high potential for loss of customer base. So long and short of it is, everyone knows it's not only threatening corporate stability, but it's making life tougher to operate competitively on the ground in China. So I'll now turn it over to Mark Plum. Mark will go through the 5 counteractive strategies the companies are developing now to mitigate the impact of China and the U.S. and China tariffs. Mark?
Sure. Thanks, Alex. Let me just run through them really quickly before we go through each one on an individual basis. First one, typically with, in this situation, we could, and not in this order, is you relocate out of China. That's certainly a strategy that could be used. A second strategy that could be used would be to expand your supply base in and out of China. In other words, find new suppliers, et cetera, in China or out of China. Third one would be very similar, would be to expand your customer base, as in finding new customers within China and outside of China. Of course, fourth one, which most people should be doing all the time, is internal cost control, watching your costs at all levels. And the fifth one would be the performance improvement through technology. Now, we're going to go through each one just quickly, and let's go first to, I think it's slide 10, Alex, relocate out of China.
All right.
Okay. So let me just minimize this. So at present, and just we got a couple of verbatims here. I'm only going to go through the top one. And basically, is that we're seeing companies that are looking to move outside of China to manufacture elsewhere in the region. Why are they doing that? Well, sometimes things have changed in China in the last 20 years, and the labor isn't what they used to be for them. Their tax incentives isn't what it used to be, and now you put on top of that the issue with tariffs. So we're going to have a case study on this in just a little bit, where we can take an example of what we've done recently with helping a company relocate out of China after they've done some pretty good due diligence. So, and again, so I don't want to belabor the point. There's the things you have to look at is just be careful when you're looking outside of the country. You got to look at labor rates, you got to look at tax rates, you got to look at supply chain, where are your customers, what's the ease of doing business, transparency, all the things that you normally thought of when you went to China. If you're thinking about leaving China, you need to begin to look at those things as well. So Alex, let's move to slide 11 or 12, I guess would be, to the supply chain. So again, a bit similar. It says 84% of the U.S. manufacturers are sourcing raw materials, are trying to diversify outside of the China area and looking to other parts of the region. This is a survey that we've conducted with a lot of our clients. And what's happening is a lot of people in China, when they first went there, they went to pretty much all tier 1 cities, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Beijing. Maybe they got aggressive and went to Suzhou. Now what we're saying is you really want to begin to look outside of China and look outside in the Southeast Asia regions. But you got to be so careful, because now you've got to be careful as far as what country you're going into, what's their perception of quality, what's their perception of transparencies and graft. Our advice is you need to move very slowly, and you need to qualify and do your due diligence. But if done correctly, and with on-the-ground expertise, you can move your supply base. You can keep or increase your quality, and at the same time reduce your costs. So, but it's not something you just do haphazardly. You have to give it strong thought and have people on the ground that can help you do that. It's just as you did with a thoroughness of when you went to China to begin with. Let's move on to the next one, Alex, if we could. So yeah, again, a little bit similar. You went to China pretty much early on. You went there 20 years ago, a lot of people. And now the geopolitical things are between the USA and China are changing. ASEAN is re-emerging as it did before China. Companies now are looking to take to markets to modify existing products and look for new markets that appeal to potential customers. So what this really says is, you might have went to China to begin with. You might have went there following a major customer, whether it's in the auto industry or the cooking kitchen industry or the HVAC industry, as a component supplier, tier 1, tier 2, and then now the market's gotten much tougher. The local competition is taking off, but you have factories, and maybe it's time to adjust your products, do a little more work, see what you can do with those products with additional channels or additional markets. For example, one of our clients was in the auto industry. We were able to help them begin to qualify and enter some parallel vertical channels. They went to off-road vehicles, lawn and garden equipment in both China and Southeast Asia. So kind of backing up, you want to expand your component supply base, but then you also want to expand your products and your customer who you sell those to. Let's move out. Let's move out to the next one. Cost cutting. I mean, this is again basic, I guess, blocking and tackling. We should be doing this irregardless. But one of the things that we've seen is customers getting complacent, our clients getting complacent, and with maybe too much labor. They went to China originally. Labor was less than $1 an hour for production labor. They threw labor at a lot of things. Well, labor is not $1 an hour anymore. Labor now has gone up where it's one of the higher, it's certainly higher than most of the Southeast Asia countries, and it's pushing the labor rates near Malaysia rates. So you need to maybe begin to use more automation, and or maybe even relocate some of your facilities to the lower labor rate areas. In the case of we've had some clients, we've had them in Chongqing, we've had them in Wuhan, Labor rates are more competitive. Transparency has improved a tremendous amount. And the Yangtze River, you can ship up the Yangtze, and that sort of thing. So that's a good way. If you cannot leave China because your business is in China, you sell in China, then you need to be more efficient in China. And again, people with resources on the ground can help a lot on that.
Hey, Mark, I just had a question pop up, and for everyone who's listening, you can use the questions on the control panel there. We've had a question popped up. We're talking about labor rates. Would you discuss labor rates? You talked earlier about Asia Pacific labor rates comparing China versus Asia Pacific.
Yeah, sure. So let me just give some examples, not some absolute numbers, but more relative numbers or comparison numbers. If labor in China, it would just say it is, for the sake of argument, right, $1 an hour. And we've just done these studies, and we're actively involved with clients in these countries. Thailand would be 50 cents an hour. Vietnam would be 25 cents an hour, or a quarter. So, or Thailand would be half of China, and Vietnam would be a quarter of China. Now, and then it can go even less if you go to Laos, Cambodia, Bangladesh, and depending what you're producing, you need to kind of match up the country with your sophistication of your product and their sophistication of their labor quality to be able to support what you're trying to do. So, and then of course the other areas are much higher. Malaysia, Singapore, that sort of stuff. Philippines would be again in the Thai range of labor.
The follow-up question from actually the same person was comparing the availability of the quality of labor in Asia Pacific versus China.
Yeah, I can handle that one too really quick because again, so for example, it's really or labor productivity would be another way to look at that. In other words, we would say, and based on factories we've had with clients and ourselves in both China and Thailand, that the labor productivity are on par, meaning Thailand is on par as being as productive of labor as China. However, Vietnam would be probably only 30, 40, 50% as productive as China. Philippines would be between Vietnam and Thailand in terms of productivity. But that's a great question. Just because that labor is cheap, you may have to put 3 times the amount of labor at it. So in turn, your total labor costs may not be as cheap as your hourly rate. So that's when you go and do your due diligence, and that's one of the things you really have to look at: the labor cost and the labor productivity in the areas that you're interested in.
Okay.
And this, Warren, just to add one other point, another key factor for people operating in the region is labor stability and turnover. Turnover has always been a major challenge in China for as long as I've been involved, and again, that's something that I think if you're looking to reassess where your operations are, there could be advantages in that regard in terms of other markets across Southeast Asia, for example. But another key factor for consideration.
Yep.
Great. All right. Thank you. All right.
Yeah, and then moving to slide 15 would be the last 5 of what we would call some mitigation that you can do to the cost pressures that you're finding in China now, and that is, it's technology, as I said in talking about the usage of the Asian Development Bank of more robotics and things of that nature, and that's certainly something you need to look at, particularly if you threw a lot of labor at your production when you first went there 10, 15, 20 years ago. Another thing you may want to look at, and where we've had some success with our clients, is the web and some online sales. And it's kind of interesting. We have a client in my prior life of mine as well, where we're selling engines and spare parts for engines on the web. And what it's allowed us to do, particularly on spare parts, is to get our parts shipped out to East to West China, Xinjiang, and Ulaanbaatar, get the parts out there, but not having to send salespeople out there and all the time. So we were able to minimize our sales force in those far-flung areas by utilizing the web and the online stuff to be a little more efficient and be able to reduce some of our direct sales costs. So.
Right.
that is just a quick run through of the five mitigating avenues to offset the tariff situation. Warren now is going to talk a little bit about how to really put that into real life action. Warren, please.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And Alex, next slide, please. Thanks. So up to this point, we've talked about the issues that companies face in operating in China and transacting business between the United States and China. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the counteractive strategies for addressing those issues. So if you, next slide, please. The starting point in the process is really to, it's specific to each company, obviously. Each company operates in a different industry, has a different set of conditions, and as we've described up to this point, there's a whole number of different things to consider. So the approach that we've found to be most effective is a two-step approach, which is number one, again, targeting the specific needs of each particular company, carrying out a one or a suite of analyses to guide the company in its decision making as to how it can overcome the challenges that it's dealing with and move forward into a better place. And an example on the left side box that you see here is a manufacturing footprint optimization analysis, or looking at what your current state is and what a potential future state may be based on criteria that is identified and agreed to with company management and reflects the current needs and the best projected needs going forward. So it's very important to the carrying out the first step and doing that in a very thoughtful and deliberate manner is quite essential to being able to implement in the next step, which is the box on the right, the actual, once a decision is made, to be able to implement the plan forward for the company. And as Mark mentioned earlier, this to do so, particularly operating in China, potentially looking at different locations across Asia, to do this will require a certain degree of bandwidth, as any change initiative does, and on the ground resources to help you support that. With, for example, in revising the global supply chain, expanding that as many companies are doing now, have been doing in reaction to increased costs, and now may be more urgently in need of that because of the uncertainty over the tariff situation. Now, next, coming up, we're going to talk about and actually present three specific case studies that we've been engaged with. The three of them actually fit the, Alex, if you go to the previous slide, the three case studies fit, actually represent examples from each of these boxes. The one that I'm going to address next, discussing make versus buy analyses, will is something that falls on the left-hand side as an assessment. Following that, Mark Plum will be introducing a case study from the right-hand side of this, which is a global footprint change. And then Alex will finish up with a case study that actually straddles both sides of the counteractive strategy development process. So Alex, if you could please move on to the next slide, I'll begin to talk about the first case studies that, and this is a make versus buy analysis. And if you could go to the next slide with the background. And this particular example, since it has already taken place prior to the tariff situation may not specifically reflect a reaction strategy to the tariffs. But the important thing to think about here is that the process remains largely the same. So in this case, a global consumer electronics company was introducing a totally new product line, and that product was built around some fundamentally new digital printing technology, and the focus of the analysis was that was a subset of that, which is a core engine for this finished product that was in final development and commercialization stages. Now, the company was well positioned, had some experience in Asia, operated its own manufacturing operation in the Yangtze River Delta region, which is the region surrounding Shanghai. It includes Jiangsu province and Zhejiang province. And that plant had a good track record and produced similar, but not totally identical technology-based products, but they were digital products, and there was some relevance to that particular factory, to this new project. It was due to the nature of the projects, of the technology and the products, as well as the economics. It was deemed that this is something that would need to be made somewhere in China. The technology was too much of a stretch for companies outside of supply sources outside of China. And one final point on the background is that the new company management, there was a new company management team, and they had admittedly a bias for outsourcing, but to their credit, they sought independent help to make an objective make versus buy analysis. So we go on to the next slide, and the first step in the process was really to form a strong working relationship and solid communications link with both senior management as well as the project technical team, gather a good understanding of the company, its background, the market it participates in, as well as the specific economic and product launch objectives from the company, along with technical requirements, which in this case were quite challenging. Required basically a pristine environment for final assembly and test, and as well as access to or capability in microelectronics assembly and test, and included things like silicon die placement and wire bonding. So some fairly specific capability. Being a digital product, productivity improvements are measured in weeks and months, not years. Very, very active. So that was a key factor, with the core engine actually at the point that the engagement started with yields less than 30%, and that was a critical factor. So if we go on to the next slide. The next step in the process was actually to formalize and standardize the process. And extensive, I'll refer to it as a template, was developed that was to be used by all candidates considered, both internally as well as externally. And this was provided a general backdrop for the ultimate decision making, and included things, important things such as the company's financial history, their evidence of financial strength and stability, who their major customers were, and trying to identify if they were overly dependent on one particular customer that could be a source of risk, potential risk, and obviously the technical and operational capabilities, quality certifications, and most importantly, evidence of currency and all that in compliance with this. So in addition to that, a package of common technical specifications were developed as well. Next slide, please.
Sure.
For step 3, the next step in the process was to deploy the formal process that was identified. That started with a search that was further refined based on the information gathered to companies in the Yangtze River Delta area and also the Pearl River Delta regions in South China because of the technical capability. Preliminary interviews were carried out with the objective of very deliberately but quickly developing a short list of finalists. And then each finalist, then a lot of detail and a lot of time was spent with each finalist to provide work with them to develop a detailed project proposal with all the basic inputs required to be able to make a valid assessment. And in this case, most of the external finalists had full in-house microelectronics capability. Now, on the internal manufacturing side, because they produced products that were similar but not identical, did not have the microelectronics capability directly in-house, at least for the core silicon part of this. The strategy was to utilize subcontractors that were in the area for that particular work, but maintain direct control over final assembly and test. And there's some unique information that we'll talk about on the next page that was critical to being able to make a totally objective analysis of both internal as well as external options. So Alex, if we go to the last step in the process in the next page, which was to pull all the information gathered together into a final analysis and recommendation. The key elements of that ultimately were not only the unit manufacturing cost initially, but most importantly, again, because this is digital products in a very dynamic environment. It was very important to look at projected productivity improvements and the case to be made by each particular candidate for that. Any upfront costs, either for unique to the external suppliers, perhaps more relevant to the internal suppliers, since that's a wholly owned facility, so all costs would flow back to the parent company. Likewise with projected cash flow requirements, because there would be differences between the two approaches, either internally or externally, in terms of who carries the inventory to what point in the supply chain. Finally, the very important in this case is really a willingness to work transparently and open book, if you will, and pass through the cost benefits of yield and productivity improvements immediately, as opposed to every quarter having to sit down and have to negotiate something or try to determine what your supplier actually achieved. That, again, because of the nature of the beast, a very, very critical element of this analysis and the final recommendation. So if we go to the next slide, which the final result on this and the recommendation to company management was to, because of the where things were on the technological learning curve, the recommendation was to maintain direct control for at least an initial 2 to 3 years, if not longer. And at the same time, the analysis actually showed that internal manufacturing costs all in, including amortization of upfront costs, would actually be approximately 10% less over an extended period of the initial period for the project, less than the most qualified supplier. It was also felt that any direct capability for microelectronics could be readily mitigated because of where their operation was located. And most importantly, that yield improvements could be driven more quickly because it's internally focused. There's no distraction from other clients operating within a subcontractor's operation, and that all financial benefits as productivity and improvements are made, would flow directly to the company. Now,
Warren,
yeah.
I had one question that popped up. A question when talking about costs here. The person wrote in that they were looking at sourcing and they were trying to define that the product was a relatively complex product. They were trying to define what are the one-time costs that can be anticipated if you're going to outsource an average complexable subcomponent or finished goods.
Yeah, so I mean, typically if it's a fairly mature item and an item that a supplier, EMS company, if that happens to be the industry you're working in, makes similarly, it could be as simple as just an FOB price. But more frequently, because there's either unique designs, something as simple as an external industrial design change, but something perhaps more complex, which involves new technology. There could be additional costs for upfront costs such as custom tooling, specialized equipment that the supplier may not be able to deploy in other areas. And also something referred to as NRE, non-recurring engineering, some upfront technical support that reflects the learning curve period of that. That's on the external side for an external supplier. All of those apply for internal operations, obviously. So hope that answers the question.
Yes.
Okay. Just one final point on this case study before I turn it over to Mark for the next one. And ultimately, in the end, this company actually elected to go with an external supplier because of the microelectronics component, but also because of their general desire to push things outside. And in the end, they had some significant struggles that led to a 6-month delay in the project. So based on that, the key takeaway that I would offer to everybody listening in here today is that for make versus buy analyses, particularly for any product that is still on somewhat of a learning curve, very, very special deliberation and considerations really are warranted in that case, and not just sending out quotes, for example, to decide something. So that wraps up that particular case study, and I'm going to turn this over back to my colleague Mark Plum, who will introduce the next case study, which is about global plant relocation. Mark?
Sure. Thanks, Warren. Yes, this is in the first mitigating list that we went through. Doesn't mean it's the first one you should do, but if after you looked at a lot of things, i.e., cutting costs, new suppliers, new customers, if the decision has been that you want to begin to look at relocating, then this case study I think would be pretty valuable. Can you next slide, please? Yeah. Oh, there you go. Perfect. Yeah. So this is actually it's a case that we're just with a client of ours that we've been working now for 18 months, and we're just finishing up on it. And I won't belabor the point, but it's a large USA manufacturer of commercial laundry. They're frankly number one and number two in the world, and they have a strong brand. They're a brand leader, certainly. They happen to have and their business has been growing in Asia for last 3 years, 5 years, total 15%. And they have a facility in Guangdong that they inherited through an acquisition of a European company that had this Guangdong facility. It's to the max from a capacity standpoint. The whole company is at a max to capacity, so they needed to add capacity. They came to us because we've known them on and off for a few years, and they said they want to build a new factory in Asia for consumption in Asia. It's going to be 10 times the size of their present factory in Guangdong, about 200,000 square feet. It's going to employ about 200 to 300 people after it gets up and running. and they anticipated it to be roughly a $50 million investment. And they asked us to give them a hand on this. And as Warren just went through, we have a 4-step process, and that's what we did. So can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so yeah, so kind of step one, you want to we knew these guys, but we wanted to get to really dig into this thing. So we went up and spent actually a day, or I think a day and a half with them, and to really find out certain things about their business. Well, one of the first things that we uncovered that they hadn't really focused on was of their facility in Guangdong, only 15% of it was really staying in China, but their sales projections were strong for both within China and outside of China. Obviously, price, they've had 3 or 4 global competitors, world-class names that you would know if I mention them. So they have to continue, and that's the reason they want to continue in Asia. These products are fairly large. They're fairly sophisticated. They're roughly $10,000 a unit. So labor costs are critical. As far as, transportation costs are critical because of the size. You need to produce, if you can, as close to your consumption of where your clients are if possible because of that. Also, labor sophistication is fairly important for the fact these are very sophisticated machines. So we went up there and did the company analysis, or the 1 or 2 day breakdown of what they were doing. So what did we do? So we went up there on phase 2 then. During phase 2, they asked us, we told them early on that we should not only look at China, but we should look at other Asian countries, and they agreed. So we put together an in-depth, a comparative analysis, working closely with the client on 6 countries: the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, China, and areas that we agreed to jointly that were important. Now, we'd already been to Thailand before. We'd been to on a prior trip. We'd already been to, and we've been there a lot, quite frankly: Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, China, certainly. So we helped them put together a matrix of what was important to them. And what was important to them was, of course, government incentives, labor costs, labor supply, inflation rates, availability of raw materials, land costs, utility costs, ease of doing business, corruption index, meaning, are you getting in something that you may not want, you can't do, domestic size of market, domestic market size, transportation, logistics, on and on and on those 6 countries. And after we did the analysis, we did the input, the consensus was by all of us, the East-West team as well as the client, that Thailand was the place we should go. And why was a combination of again, the sophistication of labor, local market, quality of manufacturing, et cetera. So then we will go to step 3 then, now that we've agreed that they want us to take a deep dive into Thailand. So what did we do? We went back. Of course, Thailand, as I said, we know it pretty well. We went and spent time with 2 of the largest industrial estates, looking at potential land, prices, soils, testing, et cetera. We begin to get pricing on land. I won't go through all these in detail. One of the most important things was tax incentives. We worked closely with the Secretary General of the Thai Board of Investment to find out from them what was available and what we could do to get the highest available tax incentives in our category. Things like training was important. Things like R&D was important. Things like sophisticated labor was important. So we begin to understand all that. Now that we know that, can we build a building? So we interviewed architects and engineers, general contractors, project management firms, staffing firms, et cetera. Gave them a deep, detailed plan to allow them to put their pro forma investment plan together, which they could take to the board, and which was approved by the board for the $50 million investment. Okay, let's go to step 4. Next slide. There we go. Hands on. So So now we've got the board on board. We've got the approval for the 50 million. So now we can go back because we have a go and finalize negotiations on board of investments, finalize negotiations on land, finalize negotiations as to working with the blueprints and the construction and things of that nature, getting all the mechanical and electrical drawings all finalized and approved. From we started that in December, got them approved in April. Get the land prep, i.e. you have to, in Thailand, for example, it's because of the soil, you have to put pilings, and we had to put 900 piles in. And then we began construction of the facility in July of 2018. At the same time, we identified and hired the early senior managers, GM of the factory, the finance director, HR director, got all that taken care of. And then we also hired facilities and operations managers that were there that just started in 2 months ago. And we're handing over the first half of the production facility. Actually, next week I'll be on site next week when we hand over the first half of the area, and we begin to bolt in production equipment. And then we anticipate, and the plan is to finalize the factory in February and full production in April. So let's kind of go to the payout of this whole thing. As I said, what happened? Well, what were we able to negotiate for this client of ours? Well, a corporate income tax holiday, i.e., no tax, corporate income tax of 25% in Thailand for 8 years. They had already used up all their tax incentives in China, and the best we could find in China was 3 years. We also got an additional 50% holiday for 5 more years. And the reason we were able to do that is working closely with Board of Investment. They told us really what we needed to do, and the client wasn't sure early on about where they wanted to put their new training center. Well, the new training center, based on this tax incentive, went to Thailand because of the fact that's they had to put one in, and also the R&D center. They wanted to have another one outside of Europe. Well, again, Board of Investment said, if you do that, so that's how we were able to work closely with Board of Investment and our client as to their investment to get these kind of tax incentives. The next numbers below are all provided by the client, really not us. And these costs, these are all compared to what the original pro forma was if they had put this factory in China. Because early on, before we got deeply involved, they were going down the road on China and done quite a bit of work on China. So what happens as compared to China, putting the factory in Thailand, they over 10 years, they estimate $22 million in corporate or tax savings. They anticipated 4.3 million annual savings, in labor, 1.8 million annual savings for material, and because there was so much of their production was being shipped to Southeast Asia, $120 a unit freight savings coming from Thailand to Southeast Asia versus Guangdong. And also with this new whole cost structure, allowed them a pricing structure to increase their sales 42% and 53% for the revenues over 5 years. So this was a tremendous cost savings, and the client is quite excited, frankly. So anyway, that was a quick case study on an ASEAN +1 or a relocation, however you want to call it, to Southeast Asia.
That's great, Mark. Thanks very much. I think that was an excellent. We're working on that. We'll finish up that building of that facility by, I guess, April of next year. So look, I'm going to take the last case study. We're going to be talking about the assessment side on the performance improvement assessment and the corporate cost cutting, which is the implementation. And this was for a client of ours, an Ohio-based company. They had a manufacturing plant on the ground in China. They had bought it 10 years earlier. I think it's 2006. Had about 750 employees at the factory. The facility itself was the plant layout workflow was pretty poorly designed. They were making product that was all coming back to the U.S. They had recently brought in a new general manager. Former general manager had left. The company had some oversight from Ohio. The CFO in Ohio was primarily involved in oversight. They brought in a new general manager, and we got brought in to do two things. We got brought in to, one, streamline the current operation, and then secondly, to cut operating costs. We knew they had a couple issues before we walked to the door. We saw them when we did plant tours. We saw them talking to management on the ground there. They had tried several times to implement previous performance improvements. Hadn't happened. They had a number of choke points in their current operation, and the operations director told us he had operation procedures and operational practices, but we never saw them when we visited the factory. We did an analysis. First step, obviously, was doing the analysis, looking at all the core areas. Obviously, we're looking at operational data, organizational data, the management culture, any lean manufacturing process they've got, the operational procedures, and talking to the employee, looking at the employee handbooks, understanding how they're motivated, how they're driven, and then their production records. We then did an assessment. As part of the assessment, we're talking to CFO, who was a sponsor, but the rest were talking to everyone on the ground in China, the general manager, who was new, the direct reports of QA, managing director, production, logistics, and then talking to the staff on the ground and then the line operators. And they were all Chinese. There were no Westerners, obviously, at the China site. Based on that assessment, we came up with a series of findings. We categorized them in 5 areas. 1 was the management practices of the company. 2 was the operational processes. 3 was a production layout, and then 4 was the pollution controls. And very quickly, to get into it, I won't go through each one of these individually. Basically, the company was disproportionately high number of mid-management, right? Very top-down model. They had wasn't a whole lot of discussion, involvement, bringing the employees into work and to identify good processes to improve the production. They had previous efforts to implement process improvement and performance improvement had failed really for lack of management involvement. And secondly, the employees were concerned they were going to lose their jobs. So neither the management nor the employees really had much interest in improving this. On the findings on the operational processes were pretty remarkable. Actually, they had a very high quality approval. They had very good low percentages of companies who were unhappy with the product. However, if you looked at their production costs, were enormously high because they had constant rework and very high level of scrap. So the amount of scrap they threw, amount of projects that were rejected by the quality department was really significant, and therefore they were making very little money at that facility, even though they were turning out an enormous amount of product. They were also very people oriented and not process oriented. So constantly there was no real direction. There were no real operational procedures in place, even though the operations director had assured us he had some. There really was. It was very manual labor, and there was no real automation, very labor intensive. On the production layout, it was a typical, very poorly run operation. The facility, when they bought it 6 years ago, it could have been laid out very well. It really wasn't. The management team there didn't focus much effort on it. And then the company grew very dramatically. Their sales have grown dramatically in China, or say the production's grown dramatically in China because of the increase in sales. And so on the production layout, it was pretty poor. They had some practices and an anodizing line and an acid washing line, and we couldn't even keep employees there because it was so dangerous. And the equipment was so old that every 6 months you'd have a whole new team coming in. So the costs were incredibly high to operate this. And then finally, on the pollution controls, we got a little nugget when we got in there, kind of blew up. We found out that, one, the company had pretty good emission control equipment in place, but it was constantly turned off to save money and was only utilized when the government safety inspector showed up. And secondly, found out the company had failed 2 environmental audits by the regulatory authorities, and they were close to getting fined, regulatory fine of up to 2.4 million RMB. And the worst case scenario was they would shut them down. Neither the new general manager or the U.S. executives knew this. The operational director was keeping that to himself. He was not conducting pollution audits, safety audits, and he had also not shared with them the fact that they were facing down the environmental committee, the environmental authorities, who had just failed him a second time and was looking at a fine. So those were our findings. We made a number of performance improvement recommendations. Obviously, you can see here under management practices, streamline middle management, the 3 people we wanted to fire, wanted to terminate the operations director, obviously, for engaging in that kind of behavior and failing environmental audits. Also, they needed to tie the bonus packages of the GM and the operational director. They needed to tie that to performance improvement goals, cost-cutting goals, avoidance of environmental fines. That was not at all the way they had operated that business, and that needed to be changed. So we recommended that. On the operational process, we obviously recommended getting in operational procedures in each division, in each unit of the manufacturing process, and secondly, having constant reviews every month between senior management and employees about the implementation of a performance improvement. What's working, what's not working, what the effect is. That way, when we recommended that, the idea is the employees will see it's reducing scrap rates, it's reducing the significant rework costs, and they're going to gradually get behind this, particularly as they realize it's not going to cost them their jobs. The recommendations made on production layout obviously was to redesign the whole entire facility, particularly the warehouse and the staging areas, and to purchase automation lines, to have them installed to eliminate the reliance on manual labor, particularly the anodizing and the acid washing area. Lastly, on the pollution controls, it goes without saying, the emission control equipment could no longer be turned off during production, right? And again, we had to tie the bonuses and their management salaries to passing internal audits from the environment, passing internal audits both from the Chinese government environmental authorities as well as random checks we would do. So we did a hands-on implementation, and we took those recommendations, gave them to the client liked them, and we then implemented them. We terminated the operations director and the 3 deputy directors, hired a new operations director, restructured the compensation packages for the GM and the operations director, reworked the processes, and redesigned the choke points in the warehouse and the plant layout. And company agreed, and we made the investment to buy several of the automation lines and began to conduct environmental audits. So that's what was on the performance improvement. And then based on that implementation, we then focused on the cost cutting. And that, as you can see here, we got a 9.5% production improvement in the production efficiency, 17% reduction in the water treatment system, 15% on the paid leave because we didn't have to be people leaving because the place had been so dangerous or so poorly run, and then a 13.8 reduction on the chemical water. Because we made these changes, we had the Chinese environmental authorities came back, did 2 trials that year, and then 2 spot checks. Company passed, and so we were able to renegotiate with them to avoid the fine of 2.4 million RMB. So that kind of touches on the performance improvements, and then how this company went about trying to cut their costs, particularly in fear of the upcoming tariff situation. Finally, as we are almost at an hour, just wanted to cover the brief summary of it. We've got some questions in about where this is all going, where the tariff situation is going. Obviously, it's, as we talked earlier, it's a broad topic, but we look at it holistically, that we think that tariffs is one of a multitude of issues you got operating on the ground in China, but it is quite serious, and we see a number of companies who are relocating supply chain, relocating facilities. Many of our clients who are on the ground in China, and they are staying in China because that's where the market is. They're got to be cutting costs and doing performance improvement and cutting costs there to make themselves more competitive in that current market. Here, from where we look at it, is when we're looking at these companies and they're explaining the situation and how they're going to handle it. Obviously, a company in China is going to be different if they're markets in China or markets in the U.S. Each company is very individualistic. The main thing here is just getting the right analysis, getting the right strategy, and then getting the right implementation along those 3 steps. So with that, we will end it at an hour. I want to thank everyone for joining us and appreciate the time. Thank you. Bye-bye.